Good morning, students, and welcome to the first session of our second workshop. As Professor MacArthur mentioned, you need to sit closer so that it will look as if there is a large crowd. And I take my cue from that because when it comes to research, unfortunately, you can't dress it up to make it look more glorious than it really should be. Okay, so you really have to sink your teeth into the realities of the research. The manner in which we are putting these presentations together is we are working from, my team and I, we're working from a general perspective and we're moving to a specific perspective. So mine is the general perspective, giving you a broad overview of, I think, a very challenging area around qualitative research. And then we will branch out to specific areas and get into the nitty-gritties of it with my other colleagues as we go along. I need to be expedient about time because with qualitative research, we tend to tell stories and we can waffle along and wad along as students, isn't it? So I'm going to be as succinct as possible and give you the essence of what qualitative research is all about. Don't try to copiously take things down. We will upload the presentations. And I am going to add to this set of slides a nice list, a crisp list of some of the resources that you can consult for your qualitative studies, if you're doing exclusive qualitative studies or if you're actually doing a combination of both. Okay? Right, now Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. I know that this is a very stressful time for postgrad students because some of us come out of the cobweb with our research and we say to our supervisors, I want to graduate next year. So what I normally do when a student tells me that, I draw a roadmap and I do a long shopping list. Here's graduation and here's all the goodies prior to that must happen. I see some of my students smiling because when they see this roadmap in front of them, and then I say to them, if you can work within real time and deadlines to get this roadmap going, you can see the end, right? But begin with the end in mind. I think that's very important. Oh, sorry, I need to get it to there. Beg your pardon. Okay, let's take this out from there. Right, okay. Let's establish very early what is qualitative research all about. There's a hype around qualitative research now, and when we have students making presentations at high degrees, we see a lot of students saying, I'm using the mixed method. So what is this qualitative research all about? Yes, it's a particular type of research. It's, of course, a generic method of gathering data. It's easier said than done because we can gather the data, but how do we make sense of it? How do we rationalize it? How do we make scientific sense of it as opposed to being emotionally charged and getting all excited about certain phenomena? Of course, you have to go into the field where the natural setting is taking place. When it comes to qualitative data, you can't sit remotely in a nice air-conditioned office or with your laptop or your tablet in some a little office somewhere. You have to get to the scene of where it's taking place, right? You have to actually get to the actual spot where the research is taking place. And you actually get involved in it. You actually become part of it. You start to observe the phenomena in its natural state. I think that's very important because when you start to observe phenomena in its natural state, you're able to pick up the nuances, you're able to pick up the gestures, you're able to pick up the silent aspects, and you're able to record all of this and observe all of these things. These are the rich data that makes your study worthwhile at the end of the day. I put there that you actually immerse yourself, you immerse yourself. When you get into a bath of water, right? You want to have a good bath, you actually get right in and you soak yourself in and you release all the stresses and the tension and whatever, okay? So you actually sink yourself right into it. You become part of it. You don't sit remotely away. Now, students often say, I want to do qualitative studies, but they actually are remote from the actual research that's taking place. And you can't be a rocket scientist and expect to absorb everything that's happening if you're actually away from where it is happening. Okay, so it's all about understanding people, why they behave the way they behave, how they behave, what are the mannerisms, etc. What are some of the points to remember when you're engaging in qualitative research? Yes, it's open-ended, and that's what becomes dangerous. Because when it's open-ended and we have different scholarly skills when it comes to research, so there might be different dubious interpretation as a student in terms of how you're capturing that information and how you're actually putting that information out into your research. But yes, it's open-ended and it is flexible, right? Now, the flexibility part I want to labor a little bit, because this is where we need to develop the skills of qualitative research so we know how to be flexible, because it might be open to abuse. So I'm going to share with you some of the nuances around qualitative research and how you operate within that flexibility. Yes, it does not control extraneous variables, right? And what are extraneous variables? Those factors that are impacting on the kind of study that you are doing. The studies and the events and processes as they unfold. Now that's the richness of it. And I think that's why students want to do qualitative studies as well. And especially in the social sciences, and I come from the social sciences. My field is public governance, public administration. And we study, I know people make jokes about it, because we look at the governance of government, the modus operandi of government. And we're studying people, processes, policies, implementation, the practicalities, the functionalities of these things, and therein lies rich data. Okay, now I put an example together for you so that we can follow the story about qualitatives, right? We're living in a time where there's a lot of natural disasters taking place, right? And let's hope that your research does not become a natural disaster, right? But there's natural disasters that become a global phenomenon. We have hurricanes, we have tsunamis, we hear of droughts and floods and all of that. And they have a catastrophic effect on service delivery. And imagine a journalist, right? A journalist does not sit in some remote place with the most fanciest of technology today and gives you an account of what is happening of a tsunami in the Middle East, for argument's sake, or what happened in Japan, right? They get to the scene of it, right? The journalist actually gets to the scene and does a visual description of what is happening, and you often find the event unfolding behind them, and sometimes they have to duck what's going on, So they actually get to the scene, and they're able to give us a rich account of what is going on. That's what journalists do. So I want you to picture that example in terms of qualitative data. And let's take the example of a natural disaster. When a natural disaster unfolds, right, we know the urgency of the situation, and the impact is the greatest at the point that it happens, right? So people's responses depend on the severity of the disaster when it just takes place, and you've got to be there to capture it. Now, the journalist that captures it at the scene of it is going to be the journalist who's going to probably win the award for capturing the visuals as it happens. The length of time since the disaster occurred, and I think that's very important, because the timing is absolutely vital. You might lose out some rich data if you actually go as a journalist a few weeks later. Then you've lost the impetus of what has happened in that particular incident, right? You study the effects of it, and you must act swiftly. That's the emphasis, because qualitative is about rich data. It's about tapping into the richness of the information. And you're getting to the site to observe the impact of it all, and you actually provide the feedback on that. Otherwise, you lose the opportunity. Okay. Now, when you're doing qualitative research, what are some of the things you need to note? It's essential to preserve the whole event. Right? Because when you start to leave pertinent aspects out, it's going to leave gaps in your research. And in Latin, we say lacunas. You don't want these lacunas that your supervisor might say, or even an external examiner might say, you left some very rich data out on a qualitative study. So the details and immediacy of the information, the quickness of it, the swiftness of the information is important. Think of this natural disaster now that is unfolded, and how you need to actually record that. Okay, what about the interrelated phenomena? What about other aspects that's impacting on the study, the phenomena, the environment in which it is unfolding? We need to be cognizant of that. Qualitative data is also about relationships, focusing on relationships. Assuming I gave you a case study to do, and I'm observing you. I will not only be picking up on your discussions, I would also be picking up on your relationships, your cohesiveness with one another, how you're interacting with one another. I did a very interesting study with my students in the first semester. I was teaching finance, and students are afraid of numeracy skills. So they say to me at the start of the course, "Ma'am, are you testing our numeracy skills?" And they don't want calculations, they want the narrative discussions. So how do you get them excited about doing budgeting and calculations? So I did a video, I did an action research with them, and I said to them, "Come in your best dress." I didn't realize they'll come as Style Network. I promise you they were so sexy little dresses and the like. But I started to observe them in the beginning they were a bit apprehensive that I'm observing them and I'm capturing them on candid camera. But eventually they settled in, and the rich data that I got out of their interaction was phenomenal. Because they forgot that I was observing them for assessment purposes. They were having fun, and they were doing this amazing budgeting exercise, and then they presented this budget to me, and it was highly competitive. But had I actually told them to do it as individual assessments, they probably would have looked at it, with jaundiced eyes. But because I allowed them to get into a natural setting, I was able to observe the richness of their interaction. And it actually was a fantastic experience. Okay, so it's about the relationships. Not to separate one from the other, or you lose the richness of it. So we need to be very witty about how we're going to interact and bead all these pieces together, weave it together so it makes sense methodologically, scientifically, so that we present this information in a format that is academically acceptable. What are some of the fundamentals of qualitative research design? Yes, it is a research approach that's guiding our studies today. A lot of students are getting very excited about the qualitative environment, particularly because the environment in which research is taking place is so dynamic. And if we don't focus on the dynamism of the environment, we're going to lose out on the kind of research that we want. Because what is the purpose of research, guys? Research is to address the gaps. Research is to fill the gaps, to make recommendations so we can improve policy, so we can enhance service delivery. So one of the ways to do that is to take qualitative and to appreciate the environment in which it's taking place. The research questions. I think it's very, very important when you're formulating your research proposal that you formulate your questions very carefully, especially when it is around qualitative studies. How do you devise a strategy, and how do you ensure that there's rational reasoning behind it? Oftentimes when students do their research proposals, they tend to sit with about 10, 15 research books, and they start to latch onto concepts, latch onto scientific concepts and put it there and say, "Oh, it makes it look so nice and it sounds very aloof, and my research proposal is going to have its intended desire." No. Depends on what it is you're researching. You have to draw from the tools, and my colleagues are going to expand on those tools. Certain tools belong to certain type of studies, right? It's not a case of just putting together a grandeur mix of words and voila, my proposal is looking fantastic, right? So the research questions must be carefully chosen, especially when it comes to qualitative studies. How do you devise this? The research setting must be studied. Now, it's important that you allocate your research setting. Where are you going to be? I said to you, you must go to the scene. So where is this research going to take place? You've got to locate your research setting, because if you don't locate it properly, then your study is you're going to lose the richness of it. And of course, the methods that you're going to use, the data collection methods. And I'm not going to go into detail on the data collection methods because Sean is going to do that, and you'll get more clarity on that. Right? Okay, so what is qualitative research all about? There's this big hype about it, and everyone's wanting to do this now. Yes, again, it's seen as a procedure to gather information. Now, it includes this big bombastic word, ethnography, right? Case studies, grounded theory, phenomenologies. Sorry, it's a tongue twister. All these big bombastic words, right? And they sound very nice to put them into your proposal, thinking we're going to impress somebody. But research is not about impressing somebody with the words. I always say to my students, whatever terminology you use, you must be able to explain it and use it in the right context. That's important, okay? So, and I will explore some of them just now for you. Then the examples of qualitative studies focuses on interviews. Can you see it's kind of action related? Interviews, focus groups, observations, document analysis, open-ended questionnaires. The kind of examples here is where you're going to get some richness of data, right? It's one thing to get the richness of data, but what are we going to do with it? How are we going to make radical sense of it? And that's where we're going to explore a little later on, right? And then how do you name these categories? How do you put them into subcategories? Because if you don't systematize the information that you receive into categories and subcategories, then you're not going to be able to create, firstly, system and order in your research, right, in your analysis chapter. And then you're not going to be able to show how they are linked to the bigger picture of your research, how they are linked to the research questions, how they are linked to your key aims and objectives. And you're not going to find a golden thread that's running through your research, okay? Okay, so doing a qualitative study is more than a plan or a set of gathering tools. It's much more than that, right? It's based on how you answer the questions in your research truthfully. There's no fabrication when it comes to research. We often hear comments in our research proposals that students present. You know what the answer is, and sometimes it becomes predictable. And the danger is that you start to produce the end result without the research revealing what the end result is. And that's the danger when you are actually in the throngs of the research and you actually work in that environment, and you know, it can become what we call insular. Okay? Okay, so what is this rubric of qualitative field research designs? And I'm going to share some words that, again, look very bombastic, right? But they belong to the body of knowledge around qualitative research. Firstly, the naturalistic inquiry. What is this naturalistic? Coming from the word naturalistic, in the studying it and appreciating it in the environment where it occurs, getting to that scene where it actually occurs. Ethnomethodology is people trying to constantly make sense of life's experiences. You know, I often say, you can have a distinction in psychology, but you'll never understand why people behave the way they do, isn't it? Right? How many of us know bipolar people in the workplace? Okay. Right, so people trying to constantly make sense of life experiences, right? And this is what qualitative studies are all about, where you're actually focusing on the interaction of people. You know, you can learn a lot by observation, right? And observation is one of the key determinants in qualitative studies. Okay, now we come to grounded theory. What is grounded theory? What is analytical, firstly? Analytical is where you are analyzing things, right? You are not just highlighting the problem, but you're analyzing it. You can't leave it hanging in the air. Analytical strategy in field research, where you're deriving the theory from the analysis of patterns, of themes, of common categories in observational data. Yes, you've got a rich data in front of you because you've observed a group of people in a natural phenomenon. But what do you do with that? Right? How do you make sense of it, right? You use grounded theory as one of the approaches to make radical sense of this data that you have, right? The data is not collected in absence of the hypotheses, okay? Then we go to case studies, and a lot of students today we see formulate their research topics, and they often put colon, a case study of da-da-da, right? So if you're using a case study method, what is this case study method about? It investigates specific phenomena holistically, right? You can't leave any stone unturned. You can't adopt a silo mentality or a fragmented approach. It's a holistic approach, right? And the emphasis is on a systematic approach. And that's what research is all about, right? You've got to be systematic about it. You've got to have system and order. You've got to be coherent, right? And I'm kind of leading on research writing skills now, you know, where things must blend together. They must connect the dots. You can't actually work in isolation of the bigger picture. What is this thing we call unit of analysis, where you are looking at single persons or organizations, right? You might choose a case study of a particular organization, right? So when we talk about unit of analysis as a concept in research, that's what we are referring to. Then we talk about critical theory, right? And this is kind of one of the very important areas around qualitative study, because when you do research, it's about a critical examination of things. It's not a superficial, it's not an emotionally charged, it's a very scientific, rigorous process, right? So critical theory is a very important one in qualitative studies. And it's influenced by humanistic and the phenomenological meta-theories, where there's an emphasis on the critique of things, right? Where you're really sinking your teeth into the actual critical analysis of things. And I gave you an example, and I said, like you are looking at power relations, you know, when you want to examine power relations, you have to get very critical about that, right? And we know that, you know, there's a lot of power relations when we start to look at social sciences, and we start to look at governance, and we start to examine models of governance. We're examining power relations, then we would use the critical theory approach. Right, now the first four that I gave you are more descriptive in nature, these four that I've just listed to you. Right, and the emphasis here is on observation and understanding of the bigger picture, right? But now let's look at the next two, which are equally important, but they focus on other aspects. And these six are kind of the approaches around qualitative study to give more oomph to your study. Right, now we come to institutional ethnography. Every experience of power relationship in women. I just took an example, and I'm not going to get too much into the details of it because Debbie's going to talk to you about ethnography as well. It relies again on interviews and observations. I don't think that's hard to do when you're observing women. Okay, you can get a lot of rich data there. I don't want to start the battle of the sexes, Brian. Okay, so you're tapping into people's experiences. And when you tap into people's experiences, you're going to get a richness of data. Right, then we got this lovely word, participatory action research, right? And I did this with my students in the exercise I told you about, where I actually did this budgeting exercise with them. I actually used a participatory action research approach, right? Where you actually get them involved, you get them to take ownership of it. And it's amazing the kind of participation that comes out. It's amazing the kind of empowerment that comes out. It's amazing the kind of emancipation that comes out. They actually get to another level. Students were saying to me, I come into this lecture room and I sit in this venue next to somebody I don't even know. I haven't even greeted. I don't even know their name. But now I'm sitting in this group, which you chose because I put them into groups, and now they understand one another even better because they were interacting and they were taking ownership of this, and it was participatory action research. And it actually brings out problem solving, analytical. Remember we mentioned analytical here. Brings out an amazing vibe amongst them. Okay, so these are the popular six that we would look at in qualitative research. Right, what are some of the steps now when you go to do qualitative studies? We said it's about system and order, and it's not haphazard, and you know, you've got to organize yourself. You can't engage in a very haphazard manner. So what are some of the steps? Firstly, you've got to choose the research setting, right? And I've mentioned this before, and I'm overemphasizing choosing the setting wisely depending on the topic that you are investigating. How do you gain access to it? Now, I don't want to go into the details of ethical clearance, but you need to gain access. And you know, I have to say this to you guys, if you're thinking of doing a qualitative study, students often get into this emotional hype, oh, I love this topic and this is what I want to do. But you gotta think about whether you can gain access for that particular topic. You don't want to discover after you're in the throngs of this and you've affectionately attached yourself to this, now it's so difficult to gain access to it. And I'll give you an example. You know, I have a student that's working in SAPS, and SAPS views research as investigative, any research as investigative. And she's sitting at a crossroads now because, you know, every topic that she had come up with, and we did the questionnaire sample, and we did the whole research proposal. We gave them the whole two to have a look at, and they said, no, it's investigative. They don't want her to do it, right? So she's lost lead time. So you need to actually first identify suss out whether you can gain access, because that's very important. You need to present yourself there. You're not going to outsource it to somebody else, right? I know we're living in a